Chapter 6, Part 1, Creating a More Perfect Union, 1783-1800. These are core objectives, and as in the other chapters, you should review these as you read the chapter to make sure you are taking notes on the important information. The first system of government for the new country was the Confederation government. We will operate under what was known as the Articles of Confederation. The Confederation system of government creates a weak central government with strong sub-governments, or what in our case we call states. You can see how the Founding Fathers would create this type of system in the beginning because they had just fought a war over a country being too autocratic and having too much power over them. And so they did not want to create another type of autocratic government. So they decided to create this confederation government. In a confederation system, the state governments will actually have more power than the federal government or the central government. In our confederation system, we will have a unicameral government, which means that there was a one-house government. There was only one branch of government, and that was Congress. So there's no executive branch and there's no judicial branch, only Congress. Congress will have all of the authority. Each state was equally represented in that Congress. So Rhode Island, which was one of the smallest states, will have the exact same representation as Virginia and New York, which were the two largest states. Also, under this unicameral system, if one state objected to a law, if you got one no vote, the laws would not be passed. We see that this confederation system also greatly limited the powers of Congress. The Confederation Congress had no power to tax. Of course, that goes also back to that problem with taxation without representation. The Founding Fathers believed that only the states had the power to tax, so they will deny the power to tax to the new central government. The Confederation Congress had the power to coin money, but all of the other states had the power to coin money, so you had the potential of having 13, 14 different types of money out there in the country, which is going to be very difficult. And that's going to mean that it's going to be very difficult to regulate trade. Each one of the states will also retain the power to establish trade agreements, and that's going to be a problem in the first few years of the Confederation Congress. The Confederation Congress could appoint military officers. They could make treaties of alliance. They could appoint ambassadors to foreign countries. So they do have some powers, but their powers are also very limited. They do not have the power to raise an army. If we were at war, they would have to ask the states to send soldiers to fight in that war. So you see very limited powers in this Confederation Congress. The Founding Fathers were also so determined to limit the power of the central government that there is an actual clause in the Articles of Confederation that said that the states would retain their sovereignty. So this is a very important point for them right after the Revolution. These limited powers, though, are going to actually be the downfall of our first government, because with a government that's so limited in its power, they are not going to be able to deal with the many problems that are going to emerge after the Revolution. One of the few successes we see that the Confederation Congress did have, though, was creating a way to regulate the new territory that we gained. Remember, according to the Treaty of Paris 1783, we were given all of those western lands all the way to the Mississippi River. And so those lands have to be governed. And so in order to do that, the Confederation Congress created the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance will basically encompass what are now the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. It established that there would be freedom of religion in that Northwest Territory. This is very much in keeping with what most of the states were now doing, having freedom of religion clauses put into their new state constitutions. It also established a method of land surveying that became the standard that will be used throughout our early history. Even after we buy the Louisiana Purchase, we'll use the same method of land surveying. We also see in the Northwest Ordinance that they will outlaw slavery. Slavery had ceased to exist really in most of the northern states by this time, and some of the northern states had even abolished slavery in their new state constitutions. So in the Northwest Ordinance, which will cover this Northwest region, they will establish that there will be no slavery. They will also create a Southwest region. The Southwest region covers those lands below the Northwest Ordinance, going all the way to basically the top of Missouri, that area. In the Southwest region, they will establish the same freedom of religion. You'll have the same method of land surveying. But in the Southwest Ordinance, they will allow slavery in those new territories. This map just gives us a visual of the Northwest Territory that we were discussing in the previous slide, so you can see exactly the land area that we were discussing. Any problems? I would love to tell you that we won our independence from Great Britain and everything was rosy from that point forward, but the Revolution, while it gave us our independence, also brought with it economic problems. Throughout our colonial history, the colonies had relied on trade with Great Britain. The Navigation Acts had promised that the British would buy many of our goods, and so we had an established market overseas. And while we were restricted from buying from other countries, we also knew that Great Britain would buy from us. Once the Revolution is over and we have our own country, Great Britain is free to buy cotton and tobacco and other products that they had got from us. They're free to buy that from other places. And so we don't have that assured market anymore, and we will have to establish trade agreements with Great Britain as well as other countries. We also are going to be heavily in debt after the war. We owe many of our own citizens as well as foreign countries. We owe France, we owe Spain many dollars from the assistance that they gave us during the war, and we have to find a way to pay off this debt. We will also see, partially because of the debt and the trade policies after the war, that we will enter into a depression the very first year after our war for independence. In 1784, we're going to have an economic depression. We are going to have issues with trade. There's no uniform trade policies. While the Confederation Congress can make trade agreements with foreign countries, we will see that each individual state will also have their own trade agreements with foreign countries. We also see that sometimes the states placed trade restrictions on each other and taxed goods coming from other states. For example, New York taxed firewood that was coming into New York State from New Jersey. And so we're going to have many trade problems with foreign trading partners, but also even among the states. There's also no uniform currency. As we stated previously, the Confederation Congress can coin money, which just means they can make money, but also the states could retain their own currency. So it makes it difficult to buy and sell when you have different currencies floating around in a country. Money is going to be a huge problem for us. How do you finance this government? How do you pay the people that are working for the government? How do you pay off this massive debt that we have acquired? Well, the central government, the Confederation Congress, did not have the power to levy taxes, and so the way they will have to acquire money is to basically just ask the states. They would send a request yearly to the states asking them to send a specific amount of money. Sometimes the states would send that money, sometimes the states would not send that money, and so that put the Confederation Congress in an awkward position, and they could establish no real line of paying how to pay the debt. The states will retain the power to tax, and each individual state will set their own taxing policies. The two most common form of taxes at this time were property taxes and import taxes. When we look at property taxes, we're talking about real property at the time, land. We're not talking about today. Often when we look at property taxes, we include things like stocks and bonds, but they only meant property taxes, and that meant that the farmers who own the most land would end up paying the most taxes, and that's going to be a problem down the road because they're not always the ones that are making the most money. Import taxes are simply what you see. They are taxing goods coming into the country. So states that had a good harbor, like South Carolina that has Charleston, or Boston in Massachusetts, they will also have import taxes that they can rely on, but the inland states do not have those import taxes necessarily. The import taxes, or what is often referred to as tariffs, are going to cause problems between the northern states and the southern states. The northern states, which had more industry, began to place tariffs or import taxes on British goods coming into the country. The southern states favored free trade because the southern states are exporting more agricultural products, and so the southern states would refuse to collect tariffs on British goods coming into the country while the northern states were taxing them. So obviously the British began sending their goods in through southern ports rather than northern ports, and so the tariff policies early on in our country began to raise sectional tensions between northern and southern states. And we see this issue of high or low tariffs remains a problem up until the American Civil War. That is one of the issues that the southern states complained about, that the northern states were passing these high tariffs that hurt them financially. The economic problems that we've been discussing on the previous slides led to an eruption of violence in 1786. In western Massachusetts, many of the backcountry farmers who were paying most of the taxes were having a very difficult time. They couldn't sell their products, they couldn't pay their property taxes, which kept growing higher and higher since that was one of the main ways for the states to make money. And many of them began to lose their farms due to foreclosure. So Daniel Shays, who was a hero and a Revolutionary War veteran, raised a small militia group to march to the state capital of Massachusetts to protest against the economic policies that were hurting the farmers. These farmers actually had three goals that they wanted from the new Massachusetts government. They wanted what they called cheap paper money. Cheap paper money is just another way of saying inflation. And normally, economically, we think inflation is bad, but if you're in a debtor group with a fixed debt and inflation causes prices to go up, it would raise the price of their farm products, which would mean that they could make more money, so they could then in turn pay their debt. So cheap paper money or inflation was one of the things that they were demanding of the Massachusetts government. A second thing that they were demanding was a reduction in property taxes. They felt that it was unfair that simply because they owned land, even though they weren't making a lot of money, that they were paying the majority of the bill for the government. So they want a reduction in property taxes. And the third thing they wanted was a suspension of the farm foreclosures. They wanted the government to demand that the banks stop foreclosing on their farms. So the three things that they asked for were not extreme, but the manner in which they asked for it was what was extreme. They marched as a militia group that was armed to the state capitol. So basically, they're demanding at gunpoint the things that they want. And so the Massachusetts government felt threatened, so they called up the state militia, and there will actually be a few skirmishes fought between the state militia and Daniel Shays' men. In one of the engagements, 3 of Daniel Shays' men were killed, and after that, the rebellion kind of petered out. Shays' rebellion, though, is going to have huge repercussions because it really woke up the powers that be in the country. Even though this was in one state, it was in Massachusetts, and it only involved that one state, the leaders of the other states and the leaders in the Confederation Congress saw that this could happen anywhere in the country because there were more debtors than wealthy people. There were more farmers than any other group. And so they realized that if they were going to maintain this new government that we've just created, that we needed to expand the powers of this government. We needed to have a government that could actually address these severe economic problems that were occurring at the time. And if we did not address those severe economic problems, our country was going to fail even before it really barely got started. So Shays' Rebellion is the act, really, that brings about the Philadelphia Convention. And the Philadelphia Convention is, of course, what we more commonly refer to as the Constitutional Convention. After Shays' Rebellion, several of the major leaders in the country decided that we needed to have a convention to strengthen the power of the central government, the Confederation Congress. So there began to be a call among the state leaders to host this convention. There was an attempt to have one in late 1786, but only 5 states actually sent representatives to Maryland to that proposed convention. So there was nothing really that could be done except to rally the troops, really, and they began to push to have one the very next year. So in 1787, they called what we call the Philadelphia Convention, or the Constitutional Convention. In the beginning, the Confederation Congress was not too keen on having this convention because they were afraid that, in essence, it would sign its death warrant, which it actually did. But the Confederation Congress did ultimately approve the Constitutional Convention. They said that the states could get together for the sole purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. So the idea was that they weren't supposed to completely change the government. They were just to revise it, to tweak it a little bit, make it a little bit better than it was, take the weak points and make it better. 2 of the big problems that they had to address was the commerce issue, the trade, the lack of uniform currency. Those are all current commerce issues. And then, of course, that led to the second big issue, which was dealing with the economic problems in the country. So those were 2 of the big problems, commerce and dealing with the economic problems. The participants at the convention, 12 of the 13 states, all of the states except Rhode Island, will send representatives. There was no set number for each state. Basically, the states sent as many as they wanted to send, as many as they could afford to send. The states sent some of the wealthiest, really, individuals in their states. The established leaders of their states will be the ones that will be there. And for this, sometimes we see that there is a criticism that our Constitution was really created by the rich for the rich, but that's really not true. If you think about it, there was only a smaller group of people at the time who were educated. And those were the people that were already the established leaders in the country. People like George Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton. Those people had led us through the American Revolution. So certainly the people are going to look back to those types of individuals to direct the creation of a new government. The goals of the participants really was to create a government that was dignified and respected, a government that could endure the test of time, a government that all people felt was their government. And when we look at what they created, in the essence that it's lasted for over 200 years, those goals were met. They have created a government that is dignified and respected. Sometimes we don't think that our governmental leaders act that dignified, but we know that we respect the government. We don't always necessarily like the individuals that are in power, but we know that we respect the government itself because most of us obey the laws of the government. Very few people disobey the government, and respect is shown through obeying those laws. So the goal is to create this dignified, respected government. It has been a lasting government, and even though it was created really by a very small group of people in our country, it is a government that has been able to stand the test of time. And when we look at our Constitution, we know that it has evolved over time. Our Constitution is one of the oldest written constitutions in the world, even though we're one of the youngest countries. And it has been able to endure, and we haven't had to scrape the whole thing and start all over because of the way the founding fathers wrote the Constitution. They wrote it so that it could be interpreted to meet the needs of the time. And that shows a level of intelligence on their part. They knew that they couldn't answer every question that would ever come to this government through all time. So they wrote the document, which is actually a very short document, so that it could be interpreted over time. The Virginia delegation was the largest delegation, and Virginia was one of the largest states. And the Virginia delegation was also the best prepared delegation when they got to Philadelphia for the convention. James Madison is one of the leaders of this Virginia delegation. The Virginia group believed that there was no saving the Articles of Confederation. They were inoperative, they would not work, and so they had already created a plan of government before they even got to Philadelphia, just completely throwing out the Articles of creating of Confederation and creating a whole brand new system of government. The Virginia Plan, as it's sometimes referred to, is also referred to as the Large State Plan. The Virginia Plan called for creating a national government that had real power. And they realized that that national government would experience some criticisms. So they said that the national government should be divided into three branches. The executive branch, which makes up the president, the presidency, the legislative branch, which of course is Congress, the Senate and the House today, and the judicial branch, which is the federal court system, which also includes the Supreme Court. And they divided power among those three branches. The goal was that each branch would have a certain type of power. Congress makes laws. The judicial branch interprets those laws. And then the executive branch makes sure that those laws are executed or followed through with. So each branch has certain powers, and so you have this division of power among the three branches. They also realized that there would be a discussion about how to put representation in the legislative branch. Well, since this is the Large State Plan, they created a system that would favor the large states. They felt that representation should be based solely on how big the state was in population. And so both the House of Representatives would be based on how many people lived in your state, so the large states would have more representation in the House of Representatives. And then, under the large state plan, the House of Representatives would select members to the upper house or the Senate. Well, you can see there's a problem potentially in that plan, because a small state may not have enough votes to get any representatives in the Senate. So the smaller states drew up their own plan once the Virginia plan was presented to them, and it became known as the New Jersey plan or the small state plan. And one of the primary authors of the New Jersey plan was William Patterson. And the New Jersey plan basically really just did tweak the Articles of Confederation. They kept the unicameral system of government with equal representation for each group. So now we have two very different plans of government, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, and we're going to have to debate on those to see what type of government we are going to end up with. And the Founding Fathers knew that these debates could become quite heated at times, so they decided very early on that all of the meetings of the delegates would be in secret. There'll be no press there. They closed the doors to the meeting hall. They even kept the windows closed so people could not hear the discussions going on, because they knew the discussions might get very heated, and they didn't want things to get blown out of proportion, because sometimes we know the media can take a small issue and blow it up out of proportion. And so the Founding Fathers didn't want that to happen. So these discussions will all be in secret up until they are ready to present the plan to the people. So let's look at this chart, which breaks out the two plans and the compromises that come up, because when you have two such radically different plans, you're going to have some compromise. As we were saying, the Virginia plan called for a national government where most power would rest with the national government. The New Jersey plan wanted to keep the Confederation system where most power would retain in the states. So the compromise is to create a federal system. A federal system was something brand new. In the federal system, if we go by the definition, in a federal system of government, you have a sharing of power, shared between the national government and shared between the states. Originally, these shared powers were pretty equal. We have seen over time the national government, which we now refer to as the federal government, has grown in power and assumed some powers that used to be state powers. But in the original plan, there were certain powers that were retained in the states, and there were certain powers that the national government had. They shared power. If you're going to have this sharing of power, this federal system, they did agree that having three branches was a good option, because in having three branches, you have this division of power that we talked about previously. So we will adopt the three branches, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch. Those separation of powers, as we were saying earlier, were designed to make sure that we did not have one of the branches that was too powerful. And from time to time in our government, we have seen when one of the branches, usually the legislative branch, tries to exert more power than it is supposed to, trying to exert power over the executive or over the judicial or over both. We have seen that, especially during Reconstruction. We saw that several instances of that. And so it is something that has happened in our history. But under the Constitution, there is a definite separation of power among those branches. They did decide that instead of having a unicameral legislature where you only have one Congress, that we would have a bicameral legislature, like the Virginia plan had suggested. Many of the states had bicameral legislatures, and so this was really kind of just a natural progression from the state legislatures. In the bicameral legislature, they decided that the lower house would be the House of Representatives, and in that lower house, every state's population would determine how many representatives they had. So the larger your state population, the more representatives you would have in the House of Representatives. But they decided that the upper house, or the Senate, should have equal representation for each state. So the Senate will have equal representation. They decided on 2 representatives from each state. So that's why today we have 100 senators. There's 50 states, 2 senators per state. In the original Constitution, the Senate was not elected by the people. In the original Constitution, the Senate was selected by their state. Most states, their legislature would choose the senators, but it was up to the state. The House of Representatives was elected directly by the people from the beginning. Well, this then brings on the question of how do you count slaves? If you're going to use population to determine how many members are in the House of Representatives, do you count the slaves? Well, the southern states said yes, we should count the slaves. The northern states said no, slaves should not count. The slaves are property, they're not people, so they shouldn't count. So they came up with kind of a weird compromise. It's known as the 3/5 compromise. They said that slaves would count as 3/5 in counting population and in property tax. So even in the original Constitution, there's debates over slavery and how to identify slaves. Are they property? Are they people? And so in the original Constitution, they said they're both. They're property and they're people, because they counted in both. And these compromises that we look at, creating the federal system, the 3 branches with the separation of powers, the bicameral legislature, and the 3/5 compromise, we often refer to that as the Great Compromise, because it created the foundations of the government. There are still going to be some questions that we have to address, but this created some of the most basic questions that arose, creating the foundation of the government. Some of the other issues that had to be discussed at the Philadelphia Convention were the slave trade, commerce, and creating money. Some of the northern states wanted to abolish the international slave trade. They saw it as very inhumane, and they felt that it was time to abolish the international slave trade. This is bringing in the slaves from Africa. The southern states objected to abolishing the international slave trade. They said that they needed more slaves. They did not have enough slaves to work the cotton fields especially, and the tobacco fields, and so they wanted to continue the international slave trade. So they made another compromise on the slave trade. They said that the international slave trade could continue for 20 years, and then after 20 years they would look at the issue again to see if it needed to continue. And so what they did is, in 20 years they did relook at the slave trade, and they decided, the federal government decided that the international slave trade should be outlawed. So in the early 1880s, we will outlaw the international slave trade. That does not mean that the slave trade within the country ended. We will still see the buying and selling of slaves among the states, and slavery will continue, of course, until after the Civil War. But we did abolish the international slave trade in the early 1800s. Another issue that dealt with the slave trade was how much to tax slaves. One of the concerns that the southern states had was that if the international slave trade continued, but the northern states opposed it, they would place a very high import tax on slaves. And so the Constitution also established a maximum tax of $10 per head for slaves being brought into the United States from Africa. So $10 was a fairly high tax, but it wasn't exorbitant, so it would not prevent the southern states from bringing in slaves. So they are making some compromises regarding slavery, but even at the Constitutional Convention, there is no discussion of abolishing slavery in the new country. even though some of the northern states had already abolished it themselves, they did not feel that it was their place to tell the southern states they had to abolish it. Another issue were the commerce clauses. Remember, trade was an issue. So in the commerce clauses, they established that interstate commerce, that is commerce between the states, could be regulated only by the federal government. And that's so that the southern states and the northern states and the western states would not start taxing each other like they had been doing before the Constitution was written. So interstate commerce is under the exclusive power of the federal government. It also established that the federal government will establish trade regulations with foreign countries. So the states will no longer be able to make their own trade agreements with foreign countries. Another major issue that had to be addressed at the Constitutional Convention was coining money. With having these 13, 14 different types of money operating out there, it was really hurting our economy. So the Constitution established that the federal government would have the exclusive power to coin money. So there will, after the Constitution is ratified, there will be only one type of money, and that is the money that is created by the federal government. The states will no longer have that power. This is just another one of those slides I like to give you that helps you see lined up in a chart what the Articles of Confederation had in it and the Constitution. So it just gives you a good comparison between the Articles and the Constitution. It took about 17 weeks for the delegates to the Philadelphia Convention to come up with the compromises that made up the Constitution of the United States. Originally, there had been 55 delegates that showed up to Philadelphia. At the end of the 17 weeks, there were 42 of those delegates left. At the end of the 17 weeks, 39 of the 42 delegates will sign the Constitution, saying that they approve it. So that's a pretty overwhelming majority that said this is a good document and we approve it. Now, them creating the document is only part of the problem. Now the Constitution has to be sent to the states for ratification. They had decided in the beginning, when they decided to create this new government, that 3/4 of the states, or 9 states, would have to ratify the Constitution in order for the new government to go into effect in those states. So we're going to see a big ratification battle going on throughout the country, trying to convince people to either vote in favor of the Constitution or vote against the Constitution. In most of the states will call what they call constitutional conventions. The issue of supporting or not supporting the Constitution will not go directly to the people. The state legislature will decide. And what we see is basically two groups emerging: the Federalists who supported the Constitution and the Anti-Federalists who opposed the Constitution. The Federalists are going to be the most well organized. They were the people like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, these individuals who had participated in the Constitutional Convention. They had written most of the Constitutional Convention, most of the Constitution, especially James Madison. He's known as the father of the Constitution because he wrote most of it. And they're very well organized. They know what's in it and they know what their intentions were. The Anti-Federalists are not as well organized. Many of them are from more of the Western territories, some of the farmer groups. They are afraid that the new government will be overpowering and become tyrannical like the English had. But they don't offer anything in exchange for it. And that's going to be one of the problems with the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists are critical of the Constitution. They can pick things out of the Constitution that they think are bad, that they think will hurt the country in the long run, but they don't offer an alternative. And the problem is that most people already recognize that the Articles of Confederation were not working. So we have to do something better. And they don't want to go back to the Articles. And so just simply saying, the Constitution doesn't work, we shouldn't ratify it, wasn't enough for most people. The Federalists will also write what becomes known as the Federalist Papers in support of the Constitution. It started out really just being newspaper essays. As the Constitution was being debated among the states, the Anti-Federalists would often write essays criticizing the Constitution and picking out everything that they felt was wrong with it. And so in response to that, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison wrote these Federalist Papers, basically correcting the Anti-Federalists and telling them what all was right with the Constitution and how it would be good for the country. The smaller states tended to ratify the Constitution first, which is very interesting because if you recall, it was the small states that had the biggest problem with the Virginia Plan in the beginning, but very early on, they are going to recognize that this is a good government and it gives them equal representation and that they will not become just subjects of the big states. And that's one of the reasons they included the Electoral College in the original Constitution, was to assure the small states that the small states would have a voice in selecting the president. Because if only the president was selected only by population, by the popular vote, then only the big states would have a voice in selecting the president. So that was one of the reasons the Electoral College was included. We can see, as we're going to look at the next slide, it's going to show us the order of the states. Delaware was one of the first states. All of the small states adopted the Constitution very early. Two of the states that there was a big debate over ratification of the Constitution were Virginia and New York, which is interesting because it was Virginia that had created the Virginia Plan, which became the basis of the Constitution. But the thing that bothered Virginia was that the new Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights for the people. The Virginia State Constitution had a Bill of Rights guaranteeing people certain rights, and they wanted the federal Constitution to have that also. So the Founding Fathers said they would make a Bill of Rights, and it would be added to the Constitution at the first Congress if Virginia would ratify the Constitution. And so Virginia agreed to ratify the Constitution, and so they became one of the supporters of the Constitution. The other state where there was a big debate was New York, and New York's problem dealt a lot with the commerce issues in the Constitution. New York City kind of played the bully in this role. New York City said that if the state of New York did not ratify the Constitution, then they would secede from New York and create their own state. And New York State knew that they needed New York City to be part of their state. So that being said, New York will ratify the Constitution. And when Virginia and New York ratify the Constitution, we will have 11 of the original 13 states that ratified the Constitution, and so the Constitution was set to go into effect in those 11 states. The two states that were holdouts were Rhode Island, which is no big surprise because remember Rhode Island did not even send delegates to the convention, and the other was North Carolina, which was also a very independent-minded state. Rhode Island and New York will eventually ratify. Rhode Island and North Carolina will eventually ratify the Constitution, but it will be many months after the other two. So let's look at the next slide. So this is the slide I was talking about. It shows you the order of ratification. As I said, Delaware was the very first in December 1787, and it goes all the way down to Rhode Island being the very last, which it won't ratify the Constitution until 1789. So much later than the other states. This slide is another one of those little charts I like to give you that helps lay out the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist arguments for the Constitution. In chart form, sometimes it helps us to see things a little bit better when we're studying. So this will be a handy tool for studying.